Stay tuned.
That wasn't that bad.
Alex is going to drink and then be a discussion. Probably not. Amy, thank you for that extremely kind, relative to what I was expecting, introduction. I know you have so much evidence, and you were kind not to have embarrassed me more. So I want to start with a logistical point about a happy hour. I think many of you know that some of our best presentations are tomorrow and tomorrow afternoon, the last day of NCME. Out of respect to these presenters and to incentivize you to stay, and because I like a good happy hour, I am hosting, I believe, the first ever informal presidential closing reception with an exclusive gift. Guessing you might be able to guess what that might be. I can tell you, though, that you will not be able to get that gift from anyone but me. There will be food and drinks and one gift per NCME badge. You will see this gift at the end of my address today, which reminds me of my bag of gimmicks. I want to announce, you'll see this gift at the end of my address today, but I want to announce the location now, so write this down. The inaugural NCME informal presidential closing reception with an exclusive gift will be Saturday, 4:30 to 6 p.m. at the Rock Bottom Brewery, which is about maybe 5 to 6 minute walk away, 1001 16th Street Mall. But just remember, Rock Bottom Brewery, food and drinks on me. I hope to see you there. I am honored to be able to launch my address. My topic for the next, I guess until time, which is 9:30, is, as previewed by our excellent incoming president, communication competencies in educational measurement. I hope to provide, 1, an argument for communication competencies, 2, guidance for communication competencies. If I am successful, I hope you will leave here today with 3, a commitment to developing communication competencies in educational measurement. I believe we need this commitment to develop these communication competencies for ourselves, for bringing new members into our field, and for the future of our field. I believe this now more than ever. Let me start with a task force for foundational competencies in educational measurement. Since 2002, my colleagues and I have been engaging our field in conversations about these foundational competencies in educational measurement. Our 12-member task force, you can see here, charged by then President Derek Briggs, who contributed many of the pictures that Amy shared, identified 3 competency domains that you can see here. 1, communication and collaboration competencies. 2, technical, statistical, and computational competencies. And 3, educational measurement competencies. Within this 3rd domain, we then identified 5 overlapping and intersecting subdomains that you can see here nested inside them, and if my morph works, now you can see them expanded. However, my focus will be on this first domain, and on communication in particular, and its intersections with other domains and subdomains. I have been presenting this framework over the past year at meetings of sibling organizations, CCSSO, the Psychometric Society, and the International Test Commission, and our own NCME special conference on classroom assessment. Although discussants and audiences have constructively critiqued various elements of our framework, I found it notable that our emphasis on communication competencies has been praised universally. There was also support for communication competencies among 8 helpful commentaries on our task force report that were published last year in EMIP. In one of these commentaries, Ying Chung and her colleagues coded 80 job postings related to psychometrics. They found empirical support for our framework in what employers are actually asking for. As you can see in this slide, communication and collaboration competencies, what Ying and her co-authors described as soft skills, accounted for almost as many of the keywords in job postings as measurement itself, and 5 times more than the current hot topic, AI, that you can see in the bottom left. Their findings mirror findings in labor economics. In his 2017 QJE paper, my colleague David Deming shows that jobs requiring high levels of social interaction grew by nearly 12 percentile points as a share of the US labor force. Dave also argues in a JPE commentary that how we develop social skills, including communication, is a largely unexplored frontier. There are only a few randomized experimental interventions, he says, but they are promising. For example, an intervention in the garment industry in India that focuses on communication and other social skills increased productivity by 13.5%. Communication is a skill we can improve in ways that improve our work. Two mentors of mine, Henry Brown and Bob Mislevy, have also long argued for communication competencies. In their famous 2005 article, Intuitive Test Theory, they identify 9 intuitive principles, or P-prims. To use a physics metaphor, and as Amy mentioned, I was a physics teacher, they say that these principles, or P-prims, are good enough to, say, guide everyday action, but not send someone to the moon. They close their article saying, and I quote, "We need to do a much better job of communicating to a variety of audiences the basics of testing and the dangers we court when we ignore the principles and methods of educational measurement." I love that they say this too. Communication is a form of teaching, and we should take the challenge of this kind of teaching more seriously than ever before. With such consensus, how can we support communication competencies in our organization and our field? Here are 3 claims that I will try to support through anecdote and argument. 1, the most important communication competency in educational measurement is all the other competencies. We cannot communicate effectively about educational measurement if we do not first understand educational measurement. But building communication is not zero-sum. Done right, time spent building communication competencies does not detract from building educational measurement competencies, it reinforces it. In short, we have the old saying, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it yet. But I would add, trying to explain it helps you understand it. Number 2, we can improve communication within our field and beyond by working towards shared metaphors, mantras, and mnemonics. Yes, I know that's not maybe completely alliterative. I will offer some for your consideration. Finally, what this all enables us to do is 1, communicate precisely about imprecision. Now that is something I think we do well. It will also, I hope, enable us to do 2, communicate decisively amidst indecision, which I think we need to improve. I want to begin-ish with what I call the Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot question. Where are you in this work? What brings you to this? She asks her students and her colleagues. Why am I, Andrew Ho, interested in communication competencies and educational measurement? When people ask me what I do, and if I want to intimidate them or confuse them, what do we say? I am a psychometrician. But my more common answer, as Amy already indicated and emphasized, is that I am a teacher. As she mentioned, my mother was a teacher. Here she is with my 2 daughters, just this past Christmas, and her mother was a teacher as well. My mom, Patrice Young, as you can see on the left there, to use her maiden name at the time, taught middle school English at Punahou School. I had a famous student that Amy mentioned back in Honolulu, Hawaii. And my grandmother, Dorothy Nip Young, taught science at Washington Middle School in Honolulu. She is pictured here with one of her students, Henry Lum, who became Chief Justice on Hawaii's Supreme Court. I think thanks to my mom's influence and her mom's influence, I have always appreciated good teaching. I appreciate not just learning from those who teach well, but learning how they teach well. Because I am a teacher, I came to testing and measurement, as Amy indicated, indirectly. As a teacher myself, and like any of you who are or have been teachers, I know the power of testing and quantification to focus and inspire learning, and also to narrow and discourage learning. As I said in that recent commentary I cited in EMIP, commenting on the 12 articles by 12 past presidents, many of whom are in this room, and their co-authors, I believe many of us come to this field because we recognized and experienced the power and peril of test scores. I identified this common sentiment across the 12 articles: urgency. Measurements are imperfect. Education is imperfect. There is still so much we do not know about how to improve either, let alone both, in interaction. Let us work together to discover how. Because I am a teacher, I believe communication competencies are an area we can all advance and improve, just as we advance and improve psychometric modeling, instrumentation, and statistical methods. The question is not who is a good communicator. The question is how can we improve the communication competencies of our students, our colleagues, and ourselves. One of my many mantras for my statistics and measurement students is, let me see if I missed this. I think I've got this, right? Is, as I said, communicate precisely about imprecision. Again, I think we in our field are quite good at that. It's what brought so many of us to this field of testing that so few of us even knew was a field, even as an undergraduate. Because we appreciate the peril and the power of test scores, and because others tend to be, as I say, weak to numbers, it brings us, I think, all here, some satisfaction to pull back the curtain like a myth buster or a magician revealing a trick. Look, we say, here was the bias and the variance of these numbers all along. We like to be precise about imprecision. But again, there's a second mantra where I think we fall short. Communicate decisively amidst indecision. I know we as measurement experts can do that first thing. My encouragement to us to communicate better is to do more of the second. In an old commentary, let's see if I'm previewing. In an old commentary, I use a metaphor that test scores are like Lego blocks. I said, I imagine our community of modern testing experts as PhD level designers of Legos. We lovingly construct versatile pieces meant to cohere elegantly into castles and starships, or in this case, a Millennium Falcon, with multi-step instruction manuals detailing their appropriate use. And we sit back and shake our heads as Lego users, test score users, neglect our instructions and build instead nondescript multicolored towers, or if we're lucky, an occasional car. We think we are selling castles and starships, but our product sells less for its intended purposes than its flexibility. Its perceived utility exists in the eyes of beholders. In the story of the monkey's paw, a charm grants wishes with horrible unintended consequences. It leaves us with the impression that a statement like, "May your wishes come true," is not a blessing, but an ominous curse. Similarly, for testing experts, it sometimes feels like the worst curse imaginable to a testing expert to say, "May your test scores be used." To explain why I think we as a field and members of our field, many of us are averse to unsanctioned test score uses, let me introduce a theory that's overblown that I call the pedantry parabola. In my statistics class, I have a lecture called The Regression Assumptions That Matter. The title refers to the fact that some regression assumptions that I myself spent weeks, months learning when I was a student simply do not matter for most practical purposes. Let me ask you all now, can you name a regression assumption that does not matter for most practical purposes? Normality is one, what's another? Well, I might disagree with you, my colleague, but no. So let's take homoscedasticity and normality as two that might, regression assumptions that might not matter. Now, if you are thinking to yourself right now, hold on, I think homoscedasticity that assumption does matter. Heteroscedasticity and normality, that does sometimes matter. Well, congratulations, you are on the pedantry parabola. What is the pedantry parabola, right? We start by not knowing the rules. We continue to believe that all rules matter. Finally, as we learn more, we learn which rules matter when. On the y-axis is pedantry, and if you, like me, need to brush up on your SAT or ACT or ITED words, a pedant, per Merriam-Webster, is one who unduly emphasizes minutia in the presentation or use of knowledge. The pedantry parabola refers to my observation that as we learn, we often become very pedantic about assumptions and definitions. Then, as we become less pedantic and perhaps more pragmatic, we learn which rules matter when, and we help others to learn when and how to apply these rules. Again, be precise about imprecision, but then be decisive amidst indecision. I joke with my measurement students that the answer to every question on my assignments is, it depends. Then I stop joking and I say, your job is to tell me what it depends on and then give me your final recommendation. By always asking these questions, I hope I am encouraging them to first consider the context of test score use. But then good communication ultimately requires deciding when to A, try to teach someone why it depends, or B, just making a case for your evidence-based recommendation, its benefits, and the costs of ignoring it. Again, communicate precisely about imprecision, then communicate decisively amidst indecision. In order to facilitate this, as Amy has already previewed, let me introduce the 3-4-5 triangle of measurement mnemonics. A mnemonic, as you know, is a device such as a pattern of letters, ideas, or associations that assists in remembering something. How can we make measurement memorable? In order to get over the pedantry parabola, to know which rules matter when, I present here this 3-4-5 triangle of measurement mnemonics, with thanks to, of course, Pythagoras. And yes, this is a mnemonic for other mnemonics, a meta-mnemonic, if you'll forgive me. To be clear, these mnemonics are not new ideas in measurement. They are re-expressions of existing principles, I hope in memorable ways. I am not claiming that these will help us to communicate necessarily with policymakers or the general public directly, but I have found that they help me to teach. And I have found that they help me and my students and my colleagues who know these mnemonics communicate better among ourselves. That is not, I think, a trivial contribution. The 3-4-5 triangle is comprised of the 3 W's that Amy has already introduced and then co-opted, which I love. Who is using which scores for what purpose? Second, the 4 quadrants, that's the 4, that identify common testing purposes. And then the 5 C's of validity evidence, a mnemonic for the 5 sources of validity evidence in the 2014 standards for educational and psychological testing. So you can't deviate from 5, Standards Committee, you can't deviate from 5. The 3 W's help us to understand the context of measurement. The 4 quadrants help us to understand which evidence is most relevant in which contexts. And the 5 C's help us to remember the sources of evidence that matter. Context, relevance, evidence. The 3-4-5 triangle of measurement mnemonics should help us to be precise about imprecision and then decisive amidst indecision. Again, in order to get over the pedantry parabola in educational measurement, I believe we need to always first ask the 3 W's who is using which scores for what purpose. I do not think it's possible to develop any research or validation agenda without first asking about these 3 W's. Of course, the NCME AERA APA standards agree with me, and in their very first standard, standard 1.1, they say, should we all recite it together? It's like the Pledge of Allegiance. The test developer should set forth clearly how test scores are intended to be interpreted and consequently used. But what's the difference between this standard 1.1 and the 3 W's? Hopefully the alliteration is catchy and memorable, but there is also something substantive, I believe. Note that the standards use passive voice. How test scores are intended to be interpreted and consequently used, it says. Interpreted by whom? Used by whom? I have encouraged the excellent Joint Standards Committee that is currently revising our standards to use active voice whenever possible. Who are the actors who have the power to use test scores to make decisions? They must be the ones who ultimately take responsibility for weighing the 5 C's of validity evidence. So we need to ask always the first 3 W's question: who uses which scores for what purpose? And next, we need to know which evidence matters when. In order to communicate how test score evidence depends on purpose, I use another mnemonic, the 4 quadrants of test purpose. This simple, and yes, also simplistic framework distinguishes between high-stakes and low-stakes uses of tests on the horizontal axis, and individual and aggregate inferences and uses on the vertical axis. As we define these axes, we see actors using tests for common purposes of testing. In the bottom left, teachers, parents, and students using student scores for low-stakes formative purposes in classrooms. In the bottom right, admissions officers or district agency officers using scores for higher-stakes admissions, selection, and remediation. Note that I'm always naming the actors. Who is responsible? Who has the power? 3, in the upper right, policymakers and state district agency officers using aggregate scores for teacher, school, or district accountability. And 4, lower stakes aggregate uses for monitoring of educational standing and improvement. Do student test scores really need to have a reliability of 0.9? When should we investigate test scores for Koretzian inflation? Why can't we use grades to monitor educational progress? The 3 W's and the 4 quadrants help us to answer these questions and, importantly, communicate the dangers of neglecting purpose and context. Now, of course, these quadrants are simplistic. To quote the saying, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. Modern testing programs do not fall neatly into any single quadrant, do they? We begin to see that these are not quadrants, but axes, nor they're axes, they are continua. And we see that purposes expand and drift. On Saturday, my co-author Morgan Polikoff will be presenting an extension of this framework for our chapter in the 5th edition of Educational Measurement. It helps us to understand, in the context of educational accountability, we do not just have actors, scores, levels of aggregation, and degrees of stakes. We have predictable positive and negative consequences that we should anticipate and address. But I think the 4 quadrants mnemonic strikes a useful balance between accuracy and interpretability. A good mnemonic should not conflict with more complex and accurate frameworks. In fact, a good mnemonic should inspire more complex and accurate frameworks. The 5 C's of validity evidence. Once we have answered the 3 W's across one or more of the 4 quadrants, and let me unpack that, once we have answered the question of who uses which scores for what purpose, and then we ask, are the inferences student level or aggregate level, low or high stakes? The validity evidence we evaluate should follow our 5 sources of validity evidence from the AERA, APA, and NCME standards. 10 years ago, when my colleague Dan Koritz passed his measurement course fully to me, I began teaching these 5 sources of validity evidence as the 5 C's of validation. I know you have committed the 5 sources of validity evidence to heart and recite them each night before you go to bed. But just to remind you, they are as follows: evidence based on test content, evidence based on response processes, internal structure, relations to other variables, and based on consequences of testing. What I have done is simply forced, with an emphasis on forced, alliteration over these sources as follows: content, or if you prefer and have a psychological leaning, construct; cognition; 3, consistency; 4, not to Laurie Shepard, I saw her back there; 4, correlation; and 5, consequence. When I teach this on day 1 of my course, it gives my students a shorthand framework to guide all our subsequent communications. My students know that no matter how we delve into quantitative psychometrics, which is primarily the 3rd C, consistency, that they should never forget the 1st C, that content should guide all judgments first and foremost. We say, first C, first. They learn that we often neglect the 2nd C, cognition. They learn that we defer too often to the 4th C, correlation. We inflate its value with misleading terms like concurrent validity or predictive validity. And they learn that the 5th C asks about the consequences of testing versus not testing, or the consequences of test A versus test B, or the context of test use A versus test use B. I tell them that we leave the 5th C too often to our economist colleagues. I believe we should be engaging more with these 5th C questions using methods for causal inference ourselves. This 5 C's framework is so memorable for students that I have caught them citing me for the 5 C's. They say, hose 5 C's, as if I wrote the 2014 standards or could claim any of our roughly 125 years of thinking about validation. For the record, I tell them to cite the AERA, APA, NCME 2014 standards instead. But this reveals the power of a good mnemonic and how good mnemonics, when shared, expedite communication among those who share a common understanding. Here are 2 stories about my attempts at being precise about imprecision and decisive amidst indecision, and how this 3-4-5 triangle of measurement mnemonics has guided me. Let's talk about CETA. As many of you know, I have worked for over the past 15 years with my colleagues Sean Reardon, Aaron Faley, Ben Shear, and many others. CETA is a national database of linked aggregate-level test scores comparable across states and over time. The effort seems to fly in the face of decades-long accepted consensus that we should not use NAEP to link, quote, uncommon measures, in this case, state test scores. What I hope my CETA colleagues and I have done is use the 3-4-5 triangle to establish a basis for aggregate comparability. Who is using which scores for what purpose? In our case, researchers and the public are the who. District average scores and grade levels are the which. And monitoring and understanding patterns of achievement and inequality is the what purpose. Now, which of the 4 quadrants? Low stakes, aggregate level. What 5 C's of validity evidence? It's in a 3rd C, or consistency study, we show how well an aggregate linking method recovers district NAEP scores. Had we had such scores for all large urban districts, we were, I hope, precise about imprecision. And then we were decisive amidst indecision, and we released these scores to the public at edopportunity.org. In a series of commentaries in a JEBS special issue, our colleagues commented on our method and decision with varying degrees of concern. In a particularly nice rhetorical flourish, my colleagues Tim Moses and Neil Durans, who I want to make absolutely clear, I genuinely hold in the highest regard, they are mentors and colleagues, quoted my own past work against me. They said, in absence of further studies, we recommend that the validation efforts of Reardon et al. Linking procedures be treated with scientific skepticism and accompanied with the warnings that have been expressed about similar studies where state assessments are linked to NAEP, e.g. Ho and Hartle. Yes, that's them citing me against myself. I have to tip my cap. But using what amounts to the 3-4-5 triangle, I try to explain, and we try to explain in a rejoinder, why I see myself as consistent. In a rejoinder, we state, we largely agree with our colleagues about the evidence and what the evidence means. In other words, we were precise about imprecision. Then we state, we nonetheless stand behind our conclusion because we believe our colleagues are underestimating the benefits and overstating the potential for downstream harm. Possible misuse is not misuse. Yet, the 3-4-5 triangle helps us, I believe, to communicate why we come to different judgments even when we agree about the evidence and what it means. Another example from CETA that I have half joked may yet get me kicked out of this organization is our use that you can see in the upper right of grade level reporting. Our CETA data show that district average test scores range 6 grade levels in the United States, a colossal amount of variance in my judgment and ours. We could have expressed 6 grade levels as 2 standard deviation units. And indeed, almost all our results correlate 0.99, whether we use a grade level or SD unit scale. One is essentially a linear transformation of the other, so we opt for grade levels. As we know, grade levels are norm referenced. Accurate interpretation requires knowing the norm, which is in our case, 1/4 of the distance between grades 4 and 8 national NAEP scores for specified cohorts in the 2010s. As we also know, but often seem to forget, Cohen-type effect sizes in standard deviation units are also a norm reference scale. The norm is the standard deviation of the reference population you choose. The dirty secret is that SD units, which applied researchers mostly seem to accept, are just as vague about their norms as grade levels. Why do we bristle at grade levels and bristle further when we divide them into weeks and months of learning and yet are acquiescent to standard deviation units? My colleagues and friends, let me emphasize friends, it's nice to have a little back and forth, Damien Biederbenner and Charlie DePascal, note in a thoughtful recent report that misinterpretations of grade levels are predictable. For example, where time-based reporting inspires time-based solutions. I concede many of their points, but defer again to the 3-4-5 triangle. Given the context and use of CETA data, I disagree with their communication and engagement strategy. As I said in a 2023 presentation to NAGB, if the public's response to historical learning loss is 3 scale score points a big deal? And a linear transformation with a clear norm group can help, I will err towards engagement. This amounts to an accuracy engagement trade-off, where accuracy using scale scores, or even what we all love but no one uses, item maps, is safe but impossible for many to understand and engage with. Meanwhile, metaphorical interpretations like time or even dollars are catnip for public interest, but they are predictably misused. The 3-4-5 triangle helps us to make strategic choices along this zero-sum diagonal. And I would argue that good communication competencies help us to bend this line so that we can be both accurate and engaging. I want to share now 2 stories that I hope emphasize the point that communication is learned over years, not months nor weeks, and that we should not be afraid of making mistakes. In 2007, as Amy mentioned, I was then a second-year assistant professor at the University of Iowa. Let's go Hawks. I received an IES grant with my colleague and friend Steve Dunbar to study growth models using non-parametric methods. Lois Gray, then the assistant director of University News Services, dutifully did her job and helped me with a press release. She even tried to get me to talk to people in the press. One person who took the bait from our press release was Matt Kelly, a reporter for Radio Iowa. For those of you who haven't done live radio interviews before, and that was me then, you jump on the phone and you hear the actual broadcast. And then right after an ad break, they just pipe you right in. And there you are, your voice on the radio to anyone listening in Iowa. At that point, mildly panicked, I decided that what the Radio Iowa listeners needed to hear was that non-parametric statistics were a great foundation for understanding how nonlinear monotonic transformations could affect growth. Matt Kelly, bless his heart, wrapped it up quick. In his Casey Kasem voice, he said something like, "Well, isn't that great? That's Andrew Ho at the University of Iowa. Now, on to sports." The lessons I took from this are painfully obvious. Know your audience, meet them where they are, imagine how they will see and hear you, and set realistic communication goals thereby. I slowly began to develop metaphors for growth that I used in subsequent presentations. I said test scores are like those mirrors at a carnival funhouse. They show your reflection, but it's warped, it's distorted. Or comparing growth with test scores is like comparing the height of 2 kids, but they're both on pogo sticks. These metaphors are not perfect. But even the effort to create a good metaphor can be a good hook that pulls a listener toward eventual understanding. After all, in order to learn, we must first be intrigued. Another valuable lesson in failure, mistakes, let's say, came in 2012 after I had downgraded from Iowa to Harvard. It says here, please pause for nods of understanding. I was a new member of the governing board that governs NAEP, which we know as a National Assessment of Educational Progress, as Suzanne, Scott, and Willie know well, and many others, many other NCME members, former as well. The NAEP board has a congressionally mandated design, kind of like Noah's Ark, another metaphor. 2 governors from different parties, 2 state legislators from different parties, teachers, principals, business representatives, curriculum specialists, and yes, designated slots for 3 testing and measurement experts. These roles are written into law. What is a testing and measurement expert's role on a board with such a variety of perspective and position? I had spent the prior 5 years in my scholarship fighting what seemed like a war on proficiency. The title of my 2008 article was "The Problem with Proficiency." Building on prior arguments by Paul Holland and Bob Lynn, I laid out a hierarchical argument in that article against the common use of proficiency percentages to measure progress and achievement gaps. Now, on the governing board that sets national proficiency standards around a table with fellow members with different perspectives and constituencies, I thought it would be a good time to climb the pedantry parabola and argue against the use of proficiency standards to measure trends and gaps. After my testimony, the NAGB chair, David Driscoll, at the time might well have said, "Thank you, Andrew, now on to sports." The problem wasn't that I was technically incorrect. My failure, again, was not knowing my audience. I wanted to teach everyone my hierarchical framework with all its nuances, but when I argued against proficiency standards to measure trends and gaps, my fellow board members heard what? Only the first part, me arguing against proficiency standards, period. It took me years from Radio Iowa to NAGB and years more on NAGB itself to develop my communication competencies, to learn how to communicate precisely about imprecision and communicate decisively amidst indecision. When the NAEP transition from paper tests in 2015 to digitally based assessments in 2017 threatened to break trend, as Amy was indicating, I argued forcefully that NAEP had one job: to assess educational progress. And the question was not whether to measure progress, but how. Peggy Carr and the experts at NCES and its contractors designed a robust bridge study. They were precise about imprecision, and then we were decisive amidst indecision. We protected the trend. When I termed off the governing board in 2020, my NAGB colleagues gifted me this cape, which, as you can see here, says protector of trend. It has become a NAGB mantra. As Jill Barshay reported just yesterday that NAEP is still struggling to meet its mandate, given cuts to funding, staff, and contracts, we may all have to don this cape together as a measurement community. We must communicate that NAEP must protect its trend from 2024 to 2026, or else fail to meet its congressional mandate to report, written into law, I quote, valid and reliable trend data. How can we encourage communication competencies in our teaching in a way that helps students learn positively from mistakes like I myself have made over decades? Last Thursday and Friday, I spent 11 hours over 2 days conducting oral exams with my first semester measurement students. Inspired by colleagues who say that assessments should be celebrations of learning, I call this the CCL, the Conversational Celebration of Learning. Each CCL takes 20 minutes and draws from assignments that students have already seen and completed. I ask students, for example, what a B parameter estimate in IRT means. But I don't just want an answer that says it's a difficulty parameter. If B equals 2, what does 2 mean? 2 what? I ask them to sketch item information functions. I ask them to define reliability as a concept they would explain to someone on the street, and then more precisely in terms of a correlation, and then in terms of a percentage of variance. If I asked you all to do the same right now, could you do this? Could you turn to your neighbor and explain what reliability is as a concept and then as a quantity? Without a text, without Google, without GPT? It is harder than we think to express these concepts in words, conversationally. Why? Because we do not practice this. But what if we assessed it? Using the CCL, this oral exam, I don't just get to assess students, I also incentivize them and encourage them to do what? Have conversations with each other about measurement, just as we do in the real world here in Denver with each other. I encourage all teachers of measurement to hold your students to similar standards of communication. I'm happy to share my oral exam protocol. Let us measure what we value. Let us encourage our students to have more measurement conversations with us and with each other, as we are doing here at this conference this week. Let us also reward what we value in terms of hiring, promotion, and tenure. The tenure policy at HGSE, Harvard's Graduate School of Education, states the candidate must demonstrate excellence on 4 dimensions, as you can see here. Speaking for myself, I see communication competencies intersecting with all of these criteria, particularly in criterion 3, clear communication to policymakers and practitioners. And evidence of their uptake of our work is for us, and I argue should be for all of us, part of the argument for tenure. Or as my colleague Bridget Long said to me when I interviewed at Harvard, if you get the chance to testify before Congress, that's worth 2 papers. In 2011, Amy related this story when the possibility of being nominated for the NAEP board first surfaced. I was a 6th-year assistant professor. I emailed my mentor, as Amy relayed, Ed Hartle, a former governing board member himself, and I said, I would be crazy to do NAGB, right? He wrote back in his typically considered way, I hope that you serve on NAGB at some point in your career, but I would not recommend this kind of service for anyone at your career stage. And I laid the issue to rest. In a sliding doors moment, Ed wrote back, as Amy mentioned, 5 weeks later. He said, and I quote, I advised you against serving on NAGB, but your name keeps coming up in various conversations. I'm still ambivalent, but I'm more inclined than I was to believe that you might really be able to make a positive difference if you were willing to serve. To early career members in the room, if a communication opportunity in measurement arises that positions you to make a major positive difference, even if your communication competencies are still developing as mine were, I hope you take that opportunity if it positions you to make a major positive difference. And to the more established members in the room, I hope we as a field reward this effort and its resulting impact. Good communication is good for our field. Is measurement research transformative research? I have time to address one major limitation of this address. The social skills that the labor market demands are not just about speaking, but listening. Not just about lecturing, but collaborating. Domain 1 in our foundational competencies is not communication alone. It is communication and collaboration. The communication I have encouraged in this address is, I believe, necessary but not sufficient. I am on another task force that the Spencer Foundation has convened with Naila Nasir, Pamela Moss, Bill Penuel, Dick Murnane, and others, called the Task Force on Preparation for Transformative Research. At a presentation at AERA yesterday, we previewed some of our recommendations for graduate study that you can see here. Methodological and theoretical pluralism, ethics, digital technologies, and knowledge mobilization. The implied argument is that measurement research alone cannot positively transform school communities directly, absent such collaboration and engagement. This argument is consistent with scholars studying culturally relevant assessment and community investment, for example, Pohai Schultz and Carrie Engler. No mnemonic can substitute for meaningful collaboration. I want to talk in my last section about gimmicks and gadgets, about mantras and memorability. In 2013, I took over a beloved statistics class from the beloved educational statistician, John Willett. John was a Brit and could get away with jokes that I could not. He also had a vast collection of what I then considered teaching gimmicks. Whereas my advisor, Ed Hartle, would, in his modest way, illustrate principal components analysis with pickup sticks and silly putty, John used giant dowels stuck in a real potato, the potato perhaps inspired by his Yorkshire roots. At the end of the semester, he would boil the mangled potato, cut it up into pieces, and offer it to students. He called this closing ritual the potato sacrament. Students recited mantras from the class like, I will maintain a type 1 error rate of, I will maintain a lifetime type 1 error rate of less than 5%. And also, I will never say significant unless the word statistically precedes it. Then they would eat the boiled potato as sacrament and be inducted into the family of class alumni. I thought this was absurd. As a young scholar, young-looking, as Amy has mentioned, as a young-looking, untenured professor struggling for legitimacy, I wasn't about to be written off as unserious, when statistics, as we all know, is serious business. I taught okay for a few years, and then one year, I decided to bring back this ritual as an homage to John, to honor the history of the class. I used French fries instead of boiled mangled potatoes. No Parmesan or truffle, unfortunately. And I made a few other adaptations to suit my own mantras. And of course, what I thought was a gimmick was, in my judgment, shockingly successful. Students remember it. And what are we teaching for, if not for our principles to be remembered? In both my statistics and my measurement classes, inspired by John's potato, I now try to incorporate, as Amy mentioned, at least one real-world tangible gadget into my teaching each week. I use the aforementioned potato for PCA in honor of John, a slinky, as Amy mentioned, for nonlinear transformations, and a Play-Doh mountain for maximum likelihood estimation. But by far, the most popular gadget is, well, now I have another one. The normal distribution plushie. If ever I am faltering, as perhaps I am now, I can hold it up and get some raised eyes, and yes, some rolled eyes, but also a memory, a connection, and maybe some learning. No joke, I held it up at a deposition a few years back to illustrate the problem with proficiency, and the lawyers requested to enter it into the record. Here it is, Exhibit 667. In my more selective measurement class, as Amy previewed, instead of the potato sacrament with French fries, I send my students off with a ritual called the plushie promise. I have adapted one for this presidential address. To end my address, I would like you all to stand, and if you would indulge me, repeat these measurement mantras after me. This is the first ever NCME. If you look at this closely, it says NCME right there, and it says NCME right there. This is the exclusive gift at tomorrow's happy hour. So, this is the first ever NCME Plushie Promise 2025. Repeat after me. On the true scores of this NCME plushie, I promise that I will navigate the pedantry parabola with the 3, 4, 5 triangle. I will ask and answer the 3 W's. I will not evaluate a test before identifying its quadrant. I will remember the 5 C's of validity evidence. I will communicate precisely about imprecision. With evidence, I will communicate decisively amidst indecision. I will commit to improve my communication competencies. And never let negative errors discourage me from raising my true score. I leave you with this. Commit to communication competencies and make measurement memorable. Thank you. One order of business remains. This is the Theta hat. The president wears it throughout its term, or has it, and at the end of their term, passes it on to the next worthy president. Please join me in welcoming President Amy Hendrickson. We are adjourned. See you tomorrow at the happy hour.